Japan's shaking scale stops at 7, and on Tuesday afternoon, Kumamoto recorded 7. A magnitude 7.1 ruptured 10 kilometres under Kumamoto Prefecture, collapsed a shopping mall with people inside, derailed a train at Yatsushiro, and sent 300,000 people into evacuation centres. Then, the Prime Minister told the worst-hit areas to prepare for another earthquake the same size. That is not alarmism, it is memory. In 2016, this same fault system did exactly that, 28 hours later. Here is what Japan is waiting on tonight. At 27 minutes and 15 seconds past 4 on Tuesday afternoon, Japan time, the ground beneath central Kyushu broke. That is 7:27 in the morning, Coordinated Universal Time on Tuesday the 28th of July. The Japan Meteorological Agency put the magnitude at 7.1 and the focal depth at 10 kilometres, with the epicenter in Kumamoto Prefecture, about 5 kilometres east of the city of Uto. 10 kilometres is the number that matters most in that sentence, and we are going to come back to it more than once. A cruising airliner flies higher than that. The rupture happened almost directly underneath the people it affected, with barely any rock between the fault and the surface to soak up the energy on its way. Within roughly 2 minutes, JMA had a tsunami advisory out. It covered the Ariake Sea and the Yatsushiro Sea, the two shallow, half-enclosed bodies of water on the western side of Kyushu, with forecast wave heights of up to 1 metre. The Pacific Tsunami Warning Center said hazardous waves were possible for coasts within 300 kilometres of the epicenter and made clear there was no threat to the wider Pacific basin. About 2 hours later, at roughly 10 past 6 in the evening Japan time, JMA lifted the advisory. No destructive tsunami was detected. An advisory at 1 metre is not a non-event, and it is worth saying why, because the number sounds small. Water moving at a depth of 1 metre is enough to take an adult off their feet and enough to move a vehicle. The Ariake and Yatsushiro seas are shallow and semi-enclosed, which is exactly the geometry that can amplify a modest wave rather than dissipate it. On Tuesday, it did not come to that, but the 2-minute turnaround between rupture and advisory is worth registering as its own data point about how this system performs under load. That is the part of this story that already has an ending. Everything else about Tuesday is still open, and the most important thing about it is not what the earthquake did, it is what the country cannot yet rule out. The magnitude is not the headline figure in Japan, the intensity is. JMA measures how violently the ground actually moved at each specific location on a scale called SHINDO, and on Tuesday afternoon, SHINDO hit 7. 7 is the top. There is no level 8, the scale simply ends there, and it ended on Tuesday in 2 municipalities in Kumamoto Prefecture, Uki City and Hikawa Town. SHINDO, 6 upper and 6 lower, were recorded at Yatsushiro, at Uto, at Misato, at Mashiki, and in Kumamoto City's Minami ward. It is worth being precise about what SHINDO 7 describes, because the wording of the standard is not gentle. At SHINDO 7, the definition is not that furniture slides across the floor. It is that furniture becomes airborne. A person cannot remain standing. Buildings without seismic reinforcement fail. Reinforced buildings can lean or tilt. This is the category Japan created for the worst shaking its instruments are designed to express. And Kumamoto recorded it on a Tuesday afternoon in the middle of ordinary business hours. Magnitude and intensity are different measurements, and they are being confused in a great deal of coverage right now. Magnitude is one number for the whole earthquake. The total energy the fault released. The same figure whether you are in Uto or in Osaka. SHINDO is one number per town. It depends on the magnitude, yes, but also on the depth, the distance and the geology directly under your feet. That is why a magnitude 9.0 offshore can produce a lower reading in some places than a magnitude 7.1 directly underneath you. If you have been reading about this earthquake in more than one place, you have probably seen two different numbers, and both of them are real. JMA carries magnitude 7.1. The United States Geological Survey's automatic solution came in at 6.8, and the European Mediterranean Seismological Center also carried 6.8, locating the event at 32.67 degrees north, 130.75 degrees east. All three agencies agree on the depth of 10 kilometres. A gap like this in the first hours after a large earthquake is completely routine. Different agencies use different networks, different instruments and different methods, and the automatic solutions get revised. But the gap is not trivial because magnitude is logarithmic. 7.1 against 6.8 is a factor of roughly 2.8 in the energy released, nearly 3 times the energy, depending on which agency your news source happens to quote. For anyone in the region, there is a simple rule here. JMA's number is the one that governs. It is the figure Japanese emergency response runs on, the agency whose SHINDO readings trigger evacuations, and the bulletin the country actually acts upon. The American figure is corroboration, and it is useful corroboration. The USGS also assigned this event a red alert on its impact scale, which is the highest classification that agency issues, indicating potential for severe casualties and economic loss. But when JMA and USGS disagree about an earthquake in Japan, JMA is the authority, and 7.1 is the number. The damage picture built through Tuesday evening, and it is still building as this goes out. The single worst location is a shopping mall in the town of Kashima. The second floor of the Aeon Mall collapsed. Reports described an explosion and white smoke rising from the building before the collapse was confirmed. One side of the structure was torn away, exposing steel beams and throwing debris across a large car park, and the mall houses somewhere around 200 stores. Between 20 and 30 employees could not be contacted. Kumamoto police sources indicated a considerable number of people were feared dead inside, and emergency crews have been working the site since Tuesday afternoon. As of the last figures available, at least one death has been confirmed, and more than 100 people have been injured. 2 separate hospitals each reported taking in at least 50 injured patients. Those numbers were still moving when this was written, and they will have moved again by the time you watch this. Treat every casualty figure in this video as a snapshot, not a total. There were multiple injuries at a care facility in Hikawa town, which is one of the 2 municipalities that recorded SHINDO 7. Emergency calls came in from people pinned under collapsed furniture across Uki. The Uki Regional Fire Headquarters reported its emergency lines overwhelmed and multiple building fires burning at once, and Kumamoto City reported fires with people trapped at more than one location. Transport across the island stopped. JR Kyushu suspended services on every one of its lines, Shinkansen and local alike. A train derailed and went over onto its side near Yatsushiro station. Early reports conflict on whether that was a freight service or a passenger service, and until JR Kyushu confirms it, that detail should be treated as unresolved rather than settled. Aso Kumamoto Airport closed its runway, with a notice on the airport's own website saying there was no prospect of resuming operations. Between 40 and 50,000 households lost power, and Kyushu Electric warned residents not to approach downed lines. The Prime Minister's office reported collapsed buildings and a collapsed bridge. Both nuclear plants in the region, Sendai and Genkai, reported no abnormalities on first-pass checks, which is the single most important early safety number on a night like this. And it is a good one. And roughly 300,000 people were told to go to evacuation centres. That last figure deserves a moment because it is easy to read past. 300,000 people is not a statistic about property. It is a Tuesday night spent on a gymnasium floor or in a community hall in a Kyushu summer by families who in many cases cannot yet be told when they will be allowed back into their own houses. Kumamoto Prefecture has a population of roughly 1.7 million. The instruction to move to evacuation centres reached a meaningful fraction of everyone who lives there, and it was issued not because of what had already happened, but because of what might. Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi said that lives were the top priority, stood up a government task force and confirmed the injuries, the collapsed buildings and the collapsed bridge. While the tsunami advisory was active, she told people to stay away from the coast. The Defence Minister ordered coordinated ground, maritime and air self-defence force operations, and approximately 3,600 personnel were mobilised, with 20 aircraft assigned to assess the damage from the air. The National Police Agency opened a disaster headquarters. Kumamoto City convened its own emergency task force. All of that is what a well-drilled state does after a major earthquake, and Japan did it within hours. But the Prime Minister said something else, and it is the reason this video exists. She instructed residents in the hardest-hit areas to prepare for another earthquake of similar scale. Read that again, because the phrasing is doing something unusual. She did not say aftershocks. She did not say, be careful of falling masonry. She said, prepare for another earthquake, the same size as the one that just flattened a shopping mall. That is not a prediction, and it is not panic. It is standard Japanese post-earthquake guidance, and a JMA official separately told residents in the areas of strongest shaking to beware of further strong earthquakes for about a week, along with the risk of landslides. But the reason that guidance exists in its current form, the reason a Japanese Prime Minister says those specific words out loud to a national audience, is something that happened on these exact faults 10 years ago. On the 14th of April 2016, a magnitude 6.5 earthquake struck Kumamoto. It produced SHINDO 7. It killed people. It damaged buildings, and it was reported around the world as the Kumamoto earthquake, because everyone involved reasonably assumed that it was. 28 hours later, on the 16th of April, the same fault system produced a magnitude 7.3. That one also produced SHINDO 7. It was substantially larger, it did far more damage, and it arrived after a full day in which people had gone back into damaged houses, because the earthquake had already happened. Afterwards, the first event was reclassified. It had never been the main shock. It had been the foreshock. The human cost of that 28-hour gap is the reason the lesson stuck. People had been through one earthquake, had been told it was over, and had returned to houses that were structurally compromised in ways nobody had time to assess. When the larger one arrived in the small hours of the 16th, it arrived on top of that. The combined sequence killed dozens directly and many more in the aftermath, and it displaced tens of thousands. Japanese disaster policy absorbed that outcome and changed its language accordingly, which is why a Prime Minister in 2026 says prepare for another one of the same size instead of saying the danger has passed. The structure involved was the Futagawa and Hinagu fault system, and Tuesday's rupture occurred on or immediately beside that same system. Mashiki, one of the towns that recorded SHINDO 6 upper on Tuesday, is the town that recorded SHINDO 7 twice in 2016, the only municipality in Japanese history to do so. Kumamoto Castle is the physical record of what that sequence did. Its stonework came down, its turrets were wrecked, and the restoration program has been running for years and is not finished. Footage circulating right now appears to show stonework falling at the castle again. Be careful with it. Old footage and new footage from that site are close to indistinguishable to anyone who is not a specialist. And recirculated 2016 video is the most likely piece of misinformation you will encounter on this story. Until Japanese authorities verify a specific clip, treat it as reported rather than confirmed. There is one more thing about the date, and it is a genuine curiosity rather than a clue. On the 28th of July, 1889, the same calendar date, 137 years earlier, a magnitude 6.3 earthquake struck Kumamoto, killed around 20 people, and damaged Kumamoto Castle. There is no mechanism by which a date influences a fault, but it does tell you something true about this ground, which is that it has been doing this for as long as anyone has kept records. Here is the part that is genuinely uncomfortable, and it is not a failure of Japanese science. There is no physical property that distinguishes a foreshock from a main shock at the moment it happens. None. A foreshock only becomes a foreshock retroactively when something larger follows it. Until that happens, or until enough time passes that it clearly is not going to, every earthquake is provisionally the main event. This is not a monitoring problem, and Japan's seismic network is among the best instrumented and best funded on the planet. It is structural. The rupture that ends up as a magnitude 7.3 starts in exactly the same way as the rupture that stops at 6.5. The difference emerges during the break, not before it. What we do have is a base rate. Roughly 5 to 6% of moderate to large earthquakes are followed by a larger event within days. About 6% within 3 days, about 5% within a week. Which means roughly 19 times in 20, nothing bigger follows. So the honest answer to whether Tuesday was the main event is probably yes. But probably is doing real work in that sentence, and this specific fault system has already produced the exception once in living memory on a 28-hour clock. Seismologists also use an empirical relationship called Bode's law, which says the largest aftershock in a sequence typically lands about 1.1 to 1.2 magnitude units below the main shock. For a magnitude 7.1, that puts the expected largest aftershock somewhere around magnitude 5.9 to 6.0. Two things about that. It is a statistical central tendency and not a ceiling. Sequences overshoot it routinely. And more importantly, a magnitude 6.0 does not need to match Tuesday to be devastating, because it will land on buildings, retaining walls, slopes and roads that are already damaged. The second hit does not have to be as strong as the first. It only has to be strong enough to finish what the first one started. There is a second empirical rule that governs how this unfolds, called Omori's law, and it is the one that gives the week its shape. Aftershock rate decays roughly as the inverse of the time elapsed since the main shock. In plain terms, most of a sequence's events happen early, and the rate falls away quickly, but the tail runs long and thin. The practical consequence is that the hours immediately after a rupture carry far more of the total risk than the days at the end of the window. The anomaly seismologists watch for is a rate that refuses to decay, a sequence that keeps producing at a steady clip instead of tapering. That would suggest the system is still loading rather than relaxing. I want to deal with one claim quickly because it is circulating hard. This did not start the Nankai Trough. The Nankai Trough is real. It is one of the most dangerous subduction structures on Earth, and the Japanese government has issued formal megaquake advisories about it within the past 2 years. The underlying fear is legitimate. But Tuesday's earthquake happened in the shallow crust of central Kyushu, on a strike-slip fault system that is structurally separate from the offshore subduction interface and tens of kilometres away from it. Stress redistribution from a shallow crustal magnitude 7 concentrates within roughly 1 to 2 fault lengths, which is tens of kilometres, not hundreds, and it drops off steeply beyond that. There is no evidence the Nankai megathrust has begun to rupture. Japan has experienced far larger earthquakes than this one. Tohoku in 2011 was magnitude 9.0, an energy release on the order of 1,000 times greater. And yet Tuesday's magnitude, 7.1, produced the highest reading the Japanese intensity scale can express. The anomaly is not the magnitude. It is the combination of magnitude, depth and location. A shallow crustal rupture directly under a densely populated prefecture, with almost no rock column in between to weaken the energy on its way up. There is a clean comparison available from the same morning. Roughly 5 hours before Kumamoto broke, a magnitude 5.9 earthquake occurred offshore Chiapas in Mexico. That event got a green alert on the USGS impact scale. Kumamoto got red. The Mexican event was not far off in magnitude terms, but distance and depth did their work, and the energy spread out before it arrived anywhere that mattered. Kumamoto's did not. That same morning, incidentally, produced 6 earthquakes of magnitude 5.4 or greater across 5 unrelated tectonic settings. 2 in southern Qinghai in China, 18 minutes apart. 1 in the Komandorskie Ostrova region, the Chiapas event. 1 in Iceland, and then Kyushu. Online, that is already being presented as evidence of something. The arithmetic says otherwise. The 7-day global count of magnitude, 4.5 and above, stands at 129, which is around 18 a day. 6 significant events in one morning across 4 plate boundaries is what an ordinary day looks like when you happen to be watching all of it at once. There is a consequence of Tuesday that will not show up in the casualty figures, and for viewers across this region, it may be the part that reaches you. Kumamoto is a semiconductor hub. The prefecture hosts Japan Advanced Semiconductor Manufacturing at Kikuyo, the fabrication joint venture operated by TSMC, the largest contract chip manufacturer in the world, along with Sony and Fujifilm facilities. Seismic intensity at Kikuyo reached SHINDO 5, which crossed the fabrication plant's evacuation threshold. TSMC pulled its people out. Sony and Fujifilm evacuated their Kikuyo plants as well. Nobody at any of the 3 sites was hurt, no damage has been reported, and TSMC said late on Tuesday that its site was unaffected and operations were gradually resuming. That is the good outcome. And it is worth stating plainly rather than dramatising. But hold the geography in your head for a moment. The wafers that come out of Kikuyo feed assembly lines in Taiwan, in South Korea, in the Philippines, in Malaysia and across mainland China. SHINDO 5 cost a few hours. SHINDO 6 Upper, which was recorded roughly 20 kilometres away on Tuesday, would have been a completely different conversation. And it is the same 10-kilometre depth that decides which of those 2 a future aftershock delivers. So what actually resolves this, and when? The next thing worth watching is not another magnitude headline, it is a map. Over the coming hours, JMA will populate the spatial distribution of the aftershock sequence, and the shape of that distribution is the real diagnostic. If the aftershocks stay tightly clustered around Uki, the sequence is behaving normally and winding down, and that is the outcome everyone wants. If they start forming a line to the northeast or the southwest along the fault, seismologists will begin asking whether stress is loading onto the next segment of the system. 2 of Tuesday's early aftershocks are already worth noting for exactly that reason. A magnitude 5.6 and a magnitude 4.9 occurred near Tsunami, about 35 kilometres to the south-southwest of the main shock, both at 10 kilometres depth. That direction is the trend of the Hinagu fault zone. There is also a clock. The 2016 sequence put 28 hours between the foreshock and the main shock. Tuesday's rupture was at 16:27 Japan time, which means that particular interval closes at around 27 minutes past 8 this evening, Japan time. Passing it proves nothing on its own. JMA's guidance window runs about a week from Tuesday, and aftershock rates decay roughly as the inverse of the time elapsed, so the risk tapers rather than switching off. But it is the marker the country is watching, and by tonight it will be behind us. Watch for 3 things specifically: JMA's aftershock bulletins and any revision to the magnitude, which frequently moves in the days after an event, the status of the Aeon Mall site at Kashima, where the casualty picture is still open, and any change in the shape of that aftershock map. Nobody can tell you tonight whether Tuesday was Kumamoto's earthquake or Kumamoto's warning. That answer already exists, encoded in rock beneath central Kyushu, and the only way anyone reads it is by waiting to see whether the ground moves again.